Hello, everyone, and welcome to the RealClear Politics Takeaway for Tuesday, January 11th. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RealClear Politics.
I'm Carl Cannon, Washington bureau chief. Morning, Tom.
Good morning, Carl. Big day today. The president and vice president are traveling to Atlanta. The president's going to give a big speech on his quote-unquote voting rights legislation, in which he's going to, we now know from reporting that he's going to endorse the idea of doing away with the changing the rules or nuking or whatever you want to call it, the legislative filibuster, meaning Democrats could push this through with just 51 votes. How big of a change is this, Carl? How big of a deal?
Well, the party in power looks upon the filibuster as something like, out of the Middle Ages. It's archaic. They describe it the way you and I would describe, trying to elicit confessions from defendants by tying them to the rack. Then when they're out of power, they suddenly think that the filibuster is, one of the great traditions of the Senate, prevents the Senate from being buffaloed by the whims of the moment, keeps the Senate from being like the House. It's pure situational ethics. And this will now give the Democrats the upper hand on hypocrisy.
Perhaps for only 11 months until they may lose their Senate majority. And then Chuck Schumer will be back to calling it a doomsday for democracy if the legislative filibuster is tampered with.
Well, wait a minute, Tom. This shows you something, though. We lost something in politics, and I don't know exactly when this happened. But when ridicule and shame are no longer weapons, it's hard to keep people acting properly if they don't fear being laughed at, if they don't fear being called hypocrites. And today's politicians are just too shameless, really, for a functioning democracy, in my humble opinion.
I totally agree with that. Carl, I'm preparing for Biden's speech. We got a preview of it yesterday from Jen Psaki in the White House press briefing room. He's going to go, this is the second part of his speech from January 6th, where he's going to say, Republicans are trying to subvert democracy. This is Jim Crow 2.0. I mean, I'm bracing myself for a cavalcade of distortions and hyperbole, over the top rhetoric about this fate of our democracy if these two pieces of legislation that the Democrats want to get through Congress do not get passed. I don't know what you think of that, but it seems to me that was one of, in my opinion, his January 6th speech, probably the most divisive, where he said, look, Republicans can't win unless they subvert the will of the voters. I mean, that just seems to me to be irresponsible and dangerous rhetoric.
Well, it's also inaccurate. I live in Virginia, where you had a high turnout governor's race. Voters were motivated, and they were motivated to elect a first-time politician, Glenn Youngkin, as governor over the Democratic establishment candidate who talked about voter suppression and racism and all the normal, the greatest hits of modern Democratic politics. If I could figure out two things, Tom, before I retire, I would die a happy man. And the two things are, A, why Republicans think that there's massive voting fraud in this country when there's very little evidence for it. And two, why Democrats think that having to produce an ID before you vote is akin to slavery. These are two nutty ideas, in my humble, centrist, nonpartisan opinion. And I guess they work for the party's base. And you'd expect a little more of a president, but, he's a party person too.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, Carl. This is obviously meant to shift the focus away from, Build Back Better, which seems to be dead now. But it seems to be heading into a dead end with Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, and now other Democrats, according to some reporting, that have reservations about, if not are outright opposed to, doing away with the legislative filibuster. So I don't know what this is intended to do other than to stoke the base of the Democratic Party because, they've been kind of dispirited watching the intra-party battle over, trying to get Build Back Better passed, et cetera, et cetera. The administration's sort of trying to deal with COVID, that this is supposed to give them sort of a shot in the arm, get them jazzed up, present Donald Trump as an existential threat, right? Biden needs some sort of foil to work against. But I'm not sure, where this leads legislatively, if they can, could end up with another defeat. And B, whether it reaches anybody beyond the base. Do independents really think it's 1964 and 65 and we need a new Voting Rights Act?
Well, no, they don't. And I'm an independent, so I can, they haven't appointed me their spokesman, but
you'll speak for them anyway. Go ahead.
Sure. Look, Tom, let's take a step back from the details of this bill. Each party's created a narrative. The narrative of the Republican Party is, written by Donald Trump, and the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. Massive fraud. It was all deliberate. It was planned. Joe Biden's in on it. So is the media. This is really unhinged and fact-free, but a majority of Republicans believe it. That's their party's narrative. The Democrats have a counter narrative, which is democracy is under assault, and the Republicans are trying to steal the next election by restricting voting in all these states and, erecting barriers to people of color to vote. And, there's no real evidence for that either. And so it would be nice if independents had a voice in Congress, and they could, sort of say to each side, why don't you cool it? And let's come up with a compromise bill that makes some sense. Not that I don't even think it's a federal issue anyway. I don't think the federal government is in power. I'm not a constitutional scholar, but the Constitution is pretty clear on that, as you pointed out last week. Voting procedures are supposed to be left to the states.
Well, and that is, I agree with that. The person who could potentially lead independents or moderates or to some sort of compromise would be the president of the United States in our system, if he were so inclined.
You mean President Manchin or President Biden?
Kamala Harris is going to get mad at you for that, Carl.
I'm sorry.
All right. Well, we'll see what Biden says in his speech today, and we'll see what the ultimate result is in terms of policy from the administration.
Well, but I've got a question for you.
Yes.
Why is Stacy Abrams not going to be present in Georgia when the president and vice president go there?
This is an excellent question. We learned that Stacy Abrams has a scheduling conflict. We don't know exactly what it is, but she will not be present. The president and vice president are coming to the largest city in her home state. She is running for governor, and she cannot make time in her schedule to show up next to them. That is not a good sign for the administration that Stacey Abrams is not willing to be present at their big event. What do you think it means, Carl?
Well, that's one explanation, and there's a historic precedent for that, and I remember it well because I interviewed the governor of Georgia. This was 1984, and his name, if memory serves, was Joe Don Harris, and he was the governor, and and Walter Mondale was coming to campaign. He was the Democratic nominee, and the governor said he had some scheduling conflict. I went to see him in Atlanta, and he looked at me, and I asked him what the scheduling conflict was. He looked at me like I was a dope. He said, look, I really don't want you to quote me, but I don't have a real scheduling conflict. He didn't even expect people to believe that. And I said, well, let's talk off the record. He said, look, I'll tell you on the record, Walter Mondale, he's a good man, but he's not popular down here. The Democratic Party, the National Democratic Party is too liberal for Georgia right now. So, he kind of shrugged and he thought it was obvious. So maybe what you say is right. And maybe that's Stacey Abrams is making that same calculation. On the other hand, this is a politician who urged Major League Baseball to boycott her own city with the All-Star game last year and then kind of walked it back awkwardly. So the other explanation is she's just not that deft a politician at figuring out what she ought to say, when running statewide. So I don't know which the answer is. I guess it's one of the two.
All right. Before we go, Carl, a shout out to the University of Georgia college football team, which won the national championship last night. First time in 40 years that they have won the national championship, beating Alabama. I stayed up. Did you watch the game? I stayed up and watched it.
I did. And Alabama took the lead. And I thought, well, that was over. And then Georgia scored 3 touchdowns in a row. It was unexpected and, for Georgia fans, delightful. I was wondering this. I didn't look it up. I probably should have. Was Herschel Walker on their last national championship team? Because that might be a novelist or a screenwriter might see that as an omen.
All right. Well, we will leave it there for this morning. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder, president of RCP.
And I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief for Real Clear Politics. And this has been the RCP Takeaway for Tuesday, January 11th, 2022.